The world had already ended before most people had even realized it. The first signs were subtle, a few isolated outbreaks, a handful of missing persons, and strange reports from small, distant towns. But the virus spread like wildfire. By the time governments and organizations tried to respond, it was already too late. The apocalypse came not with an explosion, but with the slow and relentless rise of the dead. Cities fell, societies crumbled, and civilization as they knew it disappeared in the blink of an eye. The streets of New York City were eerily silent now. Once a symbol of human achievement, the city had become a haunted monument to mankind's downfall. Only the occasional howl of a far-off zombie broke the silence, reminding survivors that the dead were always lurking nearby. The few remaining pockets of humanity had retreated into secluded areas, hiding from the infected and from the other survivors who had turned savage in their desperation. A lone survivor, Liam Harris, walked cautiously through the overgrown streets, his boots crunching on the shattered glass of abandoned vehicles. He was a former military officer, now hardened by months of surviving the apocalypse. The world had changed in ways he could never have imagined, and yet, one thing had remained constant: the overwhelming need to survive. Liam's eyes scanned the area as he approached a crumbling, once grand apartment building. His radio crackled softly, a signal from his group back at their safe house. He pressed the button on his walkie-talkie, his voice low and tense. "We're still in the area," he said, trying to sound calm despite the ever-present dread. "No sign of anything major yet. But I've spotted more infected in the downtown zone. It's getting worse out here." His radio crackled in response. "Copy that, Liam. Keep your eyes open. The group will move to your location in 3 hours. Be careful out there." Liam shut off the radio and slid it back into his pack. He had learned to trust no one in this new world, but he still held out hope that his group was different. They had survived longer than most, and their bond was stronger than just the need to live. They were family now, and that kept Liam going when everything else seemed bleak. As he made his way deeper into the building, Liam's mind wandered back to the day it all started, the day his wife, Claire, had been taken by the infected. The image of her pleading for help as she was pulled into the crowd of mindless, gnashing zombies was burned into his memory, and it was that image that pushed him to keep moving forward, even when he felt like giving up. If he couldn't save her, he would make sure the world didn't forget what had happened. Humanity's downfall was his mission now. The building's interior was even worse than the outside. Windows were shattered, and debris was scattered everywhere, creating dangerous obstacles. He tread lightly, moving quickly but cautiously, knowing that every corner could hide a zombie or worse, another desperate survivor. In the center of the building, Liam paused, sensing something out of place. He crouched low, listening intently for any sound. Then, a faint shuffle, barely audible, caught his attention from down the hall. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he realized the noise wasn't coming from a human. Zombies. Dozens of them. Liam didn't hesitate. He sprinted down a nearby hallway, zigzagging to avoid being cornered. The zombies weren't fast, but their numbers were overwhelming. He had to make it to the rooftop if he hoped to survive. He knew it would be a fight to the death. If he couldn't make it to higher ground, he'd be trapped like so many others before him. As he rounded the corner, a figure suddenly appeared in his path. A woman, dirty, bloodied, and panting, with wide, frantic eyes. She held a crowbar in one hand, but her stance was weak, her grip faltering. Liam knew what this meant. She was either running from something, or she was already marked for death. The woman spoke, her voice trembling with fear. "They're everywhere, you have to help me." Liam didn't hesitate. He reached for his weapon, ready to make the ultimate decision. Should he risk it and save her, or was she just another trap in a world filled with nothing but lies and betrayal? Liam's grip tightened on his knife as the woman's frantic gaze met his. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her face smeared with dirt and blood. In the years since the outbreak, he had learned to trust no one. The desperation in her eyes, however, made him hesitate for a moment longer. Her ragged breaths filled the silence between them, and Liam's instincts screamed at him to act. But something about her plea tugged at his heart. She was more than just another survivor trying to cling to life. She was someone who had been pushed to the very edge, just like him. "I can help you," he said, his voice as steady as he could muster, even as his mind calculated the risks. He glanced around the hallway, feeling the pressure of time. Zombies had been close earlier, and he could hear faint shuffling noises approaching. "But you need to keep it together. We don't have much time." The woman nodded frantically, her eyes wild with fear. Thank you," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "I've been alone for days. I don't know how much longer I can keep running." Liam motioned for her to follow him as he moved swiftly down the hall toward the emergency staircase. "Stick close," he warned, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "No talking unless it's absolutely necessary." She nodded, falling into step behind him, her crowbar now gripped tightly in both hands. The two moved quickly, reaching the stairwell door. But before they could slip inside, the unmistakable sound of dragging feet echoed down the hall, followed by a low growl. Zombies were coming, drawn by the noise. Liam's heart raced, and his instincts kicked into overdrive. He shoved the door open, his eyes scanning the darkened stairwell. The last thing he wanted was to get stuck in a confined space with nowhere to run, but there was no choice now. The first infected appeared at the far end of the hall, its bloodshot eyes locking onto the woman. The woman screamed, the sound too loud, too high-pitched. It was the wrong move. Liam knew it was too late to stop the panic. He grabbed her arm and yanked her into the stairwell, pushing her up the first few steps before turning back to face the approaching zombie. The creature moved slowly, but it was relentless. Behind it, another two emerged, followed by a third. More were coming. Liam was no longer counting. "Move," he ordered, his voice sharp as he shoved the woman ahead of him. "I'll hold them off." "No," she cried, turning to him with a pleading look. "You can't." Liam didn't give her a chance to argue. He pulled his handgun from his waist, knowing it would be a temporary fix. One by one, he fired shots into the advancing zombies, their bodies jerking and collapsing as they fell. But there were too many, and they kept coming. The woman's voice, now laced with fear, echoed as she shouted, "Please, don't do this." But Liam had already calculated his next move. He was not going to die here, not like this. With one final shot, he turned and bolted up the stairs, hoping to reach the rooftop before the zombies could catch up. His lungs burned with each step, his mind focused on the one goal, survival. By the time they reached the top, Liam was breathless, his legs burning with fatigue. He shoved open the door to the roof, and they both stumbled out into the open air. The wind howled, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence below. He turned, watching the door to the stairwell, waiting for the inevitable. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice low but firm. He looked around, searching for anything that could offer them a moment of respite. The city sprawled beneath them, silent, broken, and empty, just like the world they had once known. He knew this place wouldn't be their sanctuary. Not for long. "We need to find a way out of the city. We can't stay here," he continued. But as he turned to face the woman, he saw her still standing a few feet away, her face pale and haunted. He couldn't read her, couldn't figure out if the fear was directed at him or something else entirely. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice breaking. "Why are you helping me?" Liam paused, considering her question carefully. There was no simple answer. In a world like this, who was anyone anymore? Everyone had a past, but the present was all that mattered now. "My name is Liam," he said, his tone almost regretful. "And right now, I'm just trying to survive." He met her gaze, eyes hardening. "We need to stick together, or neither of us will make it out alive." The wind howled across the rooftop as Liam scanned the desolate city below. His mind raced, weighing the risks of moving further into the urban wasteland versus staying put and risking being surrounded by the undead. He was no stranger to danger, but now he had to keep the woman alive too. Trusting anyone in this new world was dangerous, but they had no other choice. They were both running out of time. The woman, still visibly shaken, had stopped speaking after Liam's declaration. She was too worn out from running, too drained to argue, but there was a spark in her eyes now. She hadn't let go of the crowbar, clutching it as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. Her silence spoke volumes. Liam knew she had lost more than just her survival instincts. She had lost hope. "We need to get out of the city," Liam said again, his tone sharper this time. His voice had become the anchor in the storm, the one constant thing they could rely on. "There's nothing left here. The longer we stay, the more likely we'll get caught." She nodded, still not trusting herself to speak. For a moment, they stood there together, the city sprawled out before them like a silent graveyard. What had once been the heart of civilization now felt like an alien world. Everywhere he looked, Liam saw destruction, broken buildings, abandoned cars, empty streets. But even in the aftermath of the collapse, he knew one thing was certain: the infected were still out there, and they weren't going to stop hunting. He turned to face the woman. "We need to find a vehicle. If we're going to make it out, we can't be walking for days." I can help," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I've been living on the outskirts of the city for weeks. I know where some old cars are parked. We can reach them if we're careful." Liam looked at her, trying to gauge whether her information was reliable. It was clear she wasn't as seasoned as he was in survival, but her suggestion was the only lead they had. She could be telling the truth, or she could be leading him into another trap. Either way, there was no other choice. "All right. Lead the way," he said, his voice calm but resolute. His hand gripped the pistol at his side as they moved toward the rooftop's edge. From there, they could climb down into the alleyway below. It was a risk, but it was the only option. The descent was perilous, and they moved quickly, ducking into the shadows whenever they heard movement nearby. The city felt alive with danger, even though it was filled with only the dead and those desperate enough to survive. The two of them stuck close, neither of them willing to let their guard down for even a second. As they crept through the abandoned streets, Liam couldn't help but wonder about her, this woman who had appeared out of nowhere, who seemed to have her own reasons for surviving. What had she lost? What was she running from? They turned down a narrow street lined with decaying storefronts, the stench of rot heavy in the air. The woman led him to a rusty old sedan, hidden behind a pile of debris. It was a long shot, but it could be their ticket out of the city. She peered through the cracked window, inspecting the vehicle. "It looks like it's still intact," she murmured. "But the battery might be dead. We'll have to try the ignition." Liam crouched beside her, scanning the surroundings. The street was deserted for now, but he knew that could change in an instant. They had no time to waste. "Let's get it started," he said, his voice urgent. The woman reached for the door handle and hesitated, glancing around nervously. "If we get caught out here," she trailed off, her voice breaking with the weight of her fear. Liam placed a hand on her shoulder, forcing her to meet his gaze. "We'll make it. We have to. We've made it this far, haven't we?" She nodded, the fear still evident in her eyes but also a flicker of something else, maybe hope. She pushed open the door and slid into the driver's seat. Liam stood guard, watching the street closely as she worked to start the engine. A moment of tense silence passed before the engine sputtered to life, coughing but holding steady. The woman's face lit up with a flicker of triumph. "It's working," she exclaimed. "We've got a chance." Liam quickly climbed into the passenger seat, eyes darting between the street and the woman, who was now grinning with relief. "Let's go," Liam said, his voice steady. "We can't afford to celebrate yet." The car lurched forward, its engine groaning as they drove cautiously through the city's abandoned streets. For a moment, it felt almost normal again, as if the world hadn't ended and they were just another pair of travelers navigating through the city. But the truth was far from that. As the car sped past crumbling buildings and empty storefronts, the threat of the undead loomed closer with every passing second. The woman took a deep breath as they turned a corner, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Liam looked out of the window, his mind racing. They needed to get far away from the city, and there was only one place that felt like it could offer a sliver of safety. "We head north," he said, his decision final. "There's a compound up there, a place where survivors have been gathering. It's our best shot." "North," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. "All right. North it is." And with that, they sped toward an uncertain future, the echo of the apocalypse ringing in their ears as they left the city behind. The drive was long, the road ahead uncertain, but Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The city, now a distant silhouette in the rearview mirror, had been a war zone. The brief moments of calm as they sped through the empty streets were deceptive. The real danger lay out there, across the vast, barren landscape of a broken world. Zombies weren't the only threat they faced, other survivors were just as dangerous, if not more so. Liam glanced over at the woman, whose eyes were glued to the road ahead. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the city, her silence still heavy with the trauma of everything she had lost. For a brief moment, he considered asking her name. But something told him it wasn't the right time. The way she gripped the steering wheel, like it was her only tether to the world, said everything. "Do you know what's north of here?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was shaky, but it held an edge of curiosity. Liam shifted in his seat, his mind whirring as he thought about their destination. "A compound," he said, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "A place where survivors are trying to rebuild. It's not much, but it's something. If there's any chance of safety, it's there." The woman nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the road. "Rebuilding, huh? I'm not sure if I believe in that anymore." Liam looked at her, trying to read her expression, but all he saw was exhaustion. She wasn't wrong. Trusting in the idea of a new beginning felt like a cruel joke in a world where everything had fallen apart. But he had to believe in something, if not for himself, then for her, for all the others he had lost. "You don't have to believe in it," he said after a pause, his voice steady. "But you have to keep moving forward. That's the only way to survive." She didn't reply, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. They drove on in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on both of them. As the hours passed, the scenery outside began to change. The lush forests and farmland that had once dotted the outskirts of the city were now nothing but barren fields, overgrown with weeds and choked by the remains of abandoned vehicles. It was a ghost world, one that no longer belonged to the living. Liam's grip tightened on the seat as they rounded a bend and spotted the first sign of trouble, a group of cars up ahead, parked haphazardly across the road. The vehicles had clearly been abandoned in a hurry, their doors flung open, leaving the remnants of a desperate escape behind. The air felt thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of Liam's neck stood up. Something didn't feel right. "They're waiting for us," he muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. The woman glanced nervously at the wreckage ahead. "What do we do?" Liam's mind raced. They could try to go around the blockade, but that would waste time and expose them to other dangers. Or they could take a risk and approach the wreckage, hoping it was just a collection of abandoned vehicles. "We move slow," Liam said, his voice low and controlled. "Keep the car moving, but be ready for anything." They slowed to a crawl, maneuvering carefully through the abandoned vehicles. As they passed a rusted pickup truck, Liam noticed something, or rather, someone, lurking in the shadows. A figure, silhouetted against the setting sun, watching them with keen eyes. The figure didn't make any move to approach, but Liam could feel the weight of their gaze. He reached for his handgun, his thumb brushing the cold steel, but he didn't make any sudden moves. He couldn't afford to escalate anything just yet. The woman noticed the figure as well, her breath catching in her throat. "Who is that?" "Stay calm," Liam warned, his voice barely a whisper. "We don't know if they're friendly." As they inched past the truck, the figure remained still, never taking a step forward. Liam's muscles were coiled tight, ready for whatever came next. But just as they were about to pass, the figure stepped into the open, a tall, gaunt man, dressed in tattered clothes and holding a hunting rifle slung across his back. His eyes were wary but not hostile, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. "Hey," the man called out, his voice gravelly and worn. "You need help?" Liam's instincts screamed at him to be cautious. Every encounter like this was a gamble, and in this world, it was often the most desperate people who were the most dangerous. "We're fine," Liam said, his voice steady but cold. "Just passing through." The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't move to block their path or raise any suspicion. For a long moment, the air between them was thick with tension. Then, without another word, the man turned and began to walk toward the wreckage of the cars, disappearing behind the debris. Liam exhaled slowly, relaxing just a fraction. They were safe, for now. "Keep going," he instructed the woman, his voice soft but firm. The woman's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles white. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone just trying to survive," Liam replied, his eyes still scanning the area. "Like us." They moved past the wreckage, the road ahead now clearer. But in the back of Liam's mind, a nagging thought lingered. Was the man truly harmless? Or was he just waiting for the right moment to strike? Either way, they couldn't afford to stop now. Not until they reached their destination. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren land, Liam felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the compound wasn't just a rumor. Maybe it was real. But even as he allowed himself that fleeting thought, he knew better than to let his guard down. In a world like this, hope was a luxury, and trust was a deadly gamble. And yet, it was all they had. The night was falling quickly as the car rumbled onward, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows over the twisted landscape. The quiet hum of the engine filled the air, but even that was drowned by the pounding of Liam's heart. Each mile that took them further from the city felt like a step closer to something uncertain, something dangerous. The compound was out there somewhere, but the road to it wasn't as simple as putting miles behind them. Every stretch of open land, every abandoned vehicle or strange noise, could hide dangers worse than zombies. Other survivors were just as much of a threat. Liam had spent enough years on the run to know that hope could be a curse in this world. Hope made you reckless, and recklessness got people killed. He had to stay alert, keep his mind sharp. The woman driving beside him, though, seemed to have no illusions about the journey ahead. She was tense, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror, as if she expected someone, or something, to appear behind them at any moment. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. The confidence she'd shown when they first started the drive had worn thin, and her question hung in the air like a cloud. Liam didn't answer right away. He didn't know if they would make it. He wasn't even sure what making it meant anymore. But he had to give her something. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But we're going to try." She nodded, taking the answer as it was, though her face didn't relax. The minutes dragged on in silence as they passed through more ghost towns, abandoned houses with cracked windows, empty streets where only the wind moved. It was a world frozen in time, untouched by life. As they neared an old overpass, the vehicle lurched. The engine sputtered, and the car began to slow, rattling on its worn tires. Liam's eyes immediately narrowed in suspicion. The road ahead seemed clear, but he wasn't going to take chances. "Stop," he said firmly. "Pull over to the side." The woman glanced at him, unsure, but obeyed. The car came to a grinding halt at the side of the road, just under the looming shadow of the overpass. Silence settled over them once more, and Liam's senses heightened. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit horizon, alert for any movement. "What's wrong?" the woman asked, voice tinged with anxiety. "What's happening?" Liam didn't respond immediately. He could feel it, the danger. They had been too comfortable. Too careless. From somewhere up ahead, the faint sounds of shuffling reached his ears. Low groans, like the breath of death itself. His grip tightened around his pistol. The undead were close. Too close. "Stay in the car," he ordered sharply, moving quickly to the door. He pulled the handle and stepped out into the cold night air, his boots crunching on the gravel. He knew there was no chance of getting out of this without a fight. As he rounded the front of the vehicle, he saw them. 4 figures, slow-moving but persistent, stumbling out from the shadows near the overpass. They didn't see him yet, but the way they moved told him they were on a hunt. The moonlight gleamed off their decaying skin, their bloodshot eyes lifeless and hollow. Liam turned back toward the car, his heart pounding. The woman was still inside, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, her face pale. "They're coming," he said. His voice was steady, but every muscle in his body was wound tight. "You need to get ready. I'll deal with them." She nodded, her fear palpable. Liam moved into the shadows, keeping low and out of sight. He knew he couldn't take all of them on at once, no, that was a death sentence. But if he could pick them off one by one, there was a chance. The first zombie, a tall man with a chunk of his neck missing, stumbled forward. Liam waited until it was nearly upon him before stepping out from behind the wreckage of an old car, his knife flashing in the moonlight as he lunged. A quick slice to the throat, and the creature dropped with a gurgle, its body collapsing lifelessly to the ground. He didn't have time to breathe. Another one was close, a woman with tattered clothes and matted hair. She screeched and lunged at him, but Liam was ready. He grabbed her by the wrist and twisted, forcing her into the side of the overpass. His knife went straight through her skull in one fluid motion, and she slumped to the ground. Liam paused for a moment, his heart racing, listening for any more approaching. The sound of their shuffling had stopped, but he knew there could be more. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. But when he turned to head back to the car, he realized the worst was yet to come. From behind the overpass, more figures were emerging. More than 4 this time. A dozen, maybe more, he couldn't tell. His pulse quickened. "Get the car started," he shouted, his voice fierce. "We need to move, now." The woman's face went white with terror. She fumbled for the keys, but the engine stalled, sputtering helplessly. Liam swore under his breath, his eyes darting between the approaching zombies and the woman struggling in the car. "Come on," he muttered desperately, his breath heavy. Finally, the engine roared to life. The woman slammed the gas pedal, and they tore out of the area just as the first of the zombies reached the edge of the road. Liam turned just in time to see the figures stumbling after them, but the car was already moving too fast. They were safe, for now. They drove for miles, the night slipping away, but neither of them said a word. The tension between them was suffocating. Liam's mind raced as he stared out the window. The compound was still a long way off. And with every passing minute, he felt that the stakes grew higher. The road was becoming more treacherous, and the realization hit him, the world might have ended, but the fight for survival was far from over. The morning light broke through the cracked windows of the car, casting long streaks of orange and gold across the barren road. The world outside seemed still, but Liam knew better. The world had never truly been still, not since the day everything collapsed. It had only been quiet for brief moments, moments when the dead weren't near or when the living weren't fighting to stay that way. His gaze shifted toward the woman beside him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her face pale from the strain of the past days. The terror they had narrowly escaped last night still hung between them like an unspoken truth. Neither of them had uttered a word since they left the horde behind. She had driven in silence, her knuckles tight around the steering wheel, her mind no doubt running through the same unspoken fears that clouded Liam's thoughts. Liam knew that the compound they were heading toward was not a guarantee. Survivors weren't always what they seemed, and he'd seen enough to know that the living could be just as dangerous as the undead. But what other choice did they have? They couldn't keep running, not forever. The sound of the engine hummed beneath them, the tires kicking up dust as the road stretched on, seemingly endless. Liam glanced at the woman. "How much further?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She didn't answer right away, her eyes flickering toward the horizon before glancing down at a crumpled map on the passenger seat. "About 30 miles, she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "We should be there by nightfall." Liam nodded, though the weight of the journey still pressed on his chest. 30 miles didn't sound like much, but in this world, 30 miles could mean the difference between survival and death. They traveled in tense silence for the next few hours. The further they went, the more desolate the landscape became. The sparse buildings and overturned vehicles gave way to open plains and ruined farmlands. They passed the occasional abandoned caravan or rusted-out truck, but there were no signs of life. Liam's eyes stayed glued to the horizon, scanning every movement. In the distance, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat, a plume of smoke rising into the air, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the compound. "They're here," he muttered, leaning forward in his seat. His fingers instinctively tightened around the grip of his pistol. "We need to stay alert." The woman nodded, but her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "What if they're not friendly?" Liam's jaw clenched. "Then we'll make sure they know we are." As the day wore on, the sky darkened, and the wind began to pick up, carrying with it a chill that gnawed at their bones. By the time they reached the compound, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in twilight. The compound was visible now, just a cluster of broken-down buildings behind a chain-link fence. There were no guards, no signs of life outside. But the smoke that had led them here was unmistakable, rising from a small campfire near the central building. The woman slowed the car, and they both watched the compound from a distance, the weight of their decision bearing down on them. Liam's instincts were screaming at him to turn away, to keep driving, to not risk whatever might lie beyond those fences. But there was no turning back now. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. She took a deep breath and steered the car toward the gates, her eyes flickering nervously to the dark silhouettes of the buildings ahead. As they approached the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, his face shadowed by a hood, his posture tense but not threatening. He didn't approach the car, but instead stood there, waiting. Liam stopped the car just short of the gate, his hand on the door handle, ready to act at a moment's notice. The woman's hand rested on the dashboard, her fingers trembling slightly. "Who are you?" the man called out, his voice steady but wary. "This is private property." Liam kept his tone calm, controlled. "We're survivors. We need shelter." The man didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the car and the two of them. It was clear he was sizing them up, deciding whether they were a threat or not. After a tense moment, he nodded. "All right. But I'm taking you to the leader. You stay close and don't try anything." Liam glanced at the woman, who nodded almost imperceptibly. He wasn't sure what to expect from this compound, but there was no other option. They couldn't afford to turn back now. The man led them through the rusted gates and into the compound, which looked like a collection of survivors trying to make do. There were a few makeshift tents, a few scattered figures, but it felt like a place built more on desperation than hope. As they approached the central building, the sound of voices reached them, shouting, arguing. The door to the building swung open, and a tall woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder stepped out. She looked them over with a calculating gaze, her eyes hard but not hostile. "We don't take kindly to strangers," she said, her voice carrying a cold edge. "What makes you think you're safe here?" Liam's heart beat faster. The tension was palpable now. "We don't want trouble," he said, his voice firm. "We just need a place to rest, a chance to survive." The woman studied them for a long moment, then stepped aside. "We all need that. But there's a price. Everything comes with a price." Liam nodded, understanding what she meant without needing further explanation. It was always the same. People would help, but there was always something they wanted in return. They entered the compound, the gates closing behind them with a heavy clang. But as the door shut, Liam knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. Survival wasn't guaranteed, not even here. And with that realization, the weight of their journey seemed to grow heavier. There was no safety. There was no final destination in this world. Only the fight to keep going, day by day, hour by hour, until the end.